Few people would have predicted in 1908 that the quiet president of Princeton University would become president in 1912. Prior to 1910, Woodrow Wilson never run for anything, nor had he held an appointed office even. He had practiced law briefly after graduating from Princeton, which was called the College of New Jersey then, before starting an academic career. He was a teacher. He became president of Princeton in 1902 and remained there until he ran for governor of New Jersey in 1910. So he was governor of New Jersey for 2 years before he ran for president. Throughout his academic career, however, he'd aspired to a political career. He'd focused in academia on the workings of government. In 1885, he published a work called Congressional Government, a brilliant analysis and critique of Congress that would long remain the most important work in its field. He greatly admired British prime ministers, Benjamin Disraeli and William Gladstone, who dominated British government in the late 19th century. He received great acclaim for his leadership at Princeton, transforming it from a mediocre college into a world-class university. Woodrow Wilson's public stature at Princeton gave him a forum to comment on political as well as educational matters. He identified himself as a part of the anti-Bryan wing of the Democratic Party, and note that would be the conservative wing of that Democratic Party, and attracted the attention of wealthy conservatives, therefore, who already saw him as a presidential possibility. The New Jersey Democratic machine, therefore, gave him the nomination for governor in 1910, and he won easily. He then shocked his conservative backers by declaring his independence from the machine and moving New Jersey to the forefront of the reform movement. Woodrow Wilson embraced reform partly from expediency. Already aspiring to the presidency, he sensed that an alliance with reformers rather than those favoring the status quo would advance him politically. But his turn toward progressivism also reflected something his conservative backers had failed to detect. His strict Presbyterian upbringing had instilled in him a strong sense that society should be governed by God's moral law. In the 1880s, he had found the social consequences of unregulated industrialization repugnant to his Christian ethical principles. He said, quote, "The modern industrial organization has so distorted competition as to put it into the power of some to tyrannize over many, as to enable the rich and strong to combine against the poor and the weak." As a young man, he was actually drawn to socialism. But those early sympathies dissolved amid the anger, chaos, and violence of the agrarian and labor uprisings of the 1890s. Woodrow Wilson wanted reform in an orderly, peaceful way. He recoiled from labor and populist agitators who had no respect for existing social and political institutions. He stressed the values of order, harmony, and tradition in his speeches at Princeton. His reform instincts had receded by 1910, but not disappeared, and as governor of New Jersey in 1911 and 1912, he became one of the most outspoken progressives in the country. Woodrow Wilson was a dark horse candidate at the Democratic Convention. The number one candidate was Speaker of the House, Champ Clark of Missouri. But finally, after 46 rounds of balloting, Wilson had the nomination. The exhausted Democrats closed ranks behind Wilson and pledged to renew the national campaign for reform. The stage was set for a momentous 1912 election. Democrats had their best chance in 20 years to win. A Woodrow Wilson victory would also give the nation its first Southern-born president in 50 years. Although he lived much of his adult life in the North, Wilson was raised in Augusta, Georgia. Whatever the outcome of the election, a hefty vote for reform was expected. Roosevelt, as you already know, was campaigning vigorously. Debs was campaigning vigorously. Taft barely even bothered. Debate among the candidates focused on the trusts. All three reform candidates agreed that corporations had acquired too much economic power. They had three different ways to resolve that problem, though. Debs argued the only way to ensure popular control was for the federal government to nationalize the trusts, take over the businesses. Wilson recoiled from this, as did TR, of course. TR called for leave the trust intact, but have a really powerful federal government that would regulate and, if necessary, curb the power of trust. This is this new nationalism he'd been espousing since 1910. Wilson sort of advocated a middle way. He was too suspicious of a centralized government. That's ironic, because Wilson is going to arrogate more power to the presidency and the central government in general than anybody before or since. Anyway, he was suspicious of a centralized government. to countenance, too much so to countenance new nationalism. He wanted to reverse the tendency toward economic concentration and thus restore opportunity to the people. He labeled his philosophy New Freedom. This would be a temporary concentration of governmental power to dismantle the trust and then to relinquish the power once that job was done. Well, you can review the numbers again. I talked about them last time. And if you look at those numbers, you'll realize that over 75% of the people voted for some kind of reform. Wilson, TR, and Debs all represented reform. Never had there been such a popular mandate for reform, and Woodrow Wilson rose to the challenge.